My name is Shannon. I am the mysterious ATH speaker. And this is also my final ATH introduction as a student fellow for the year, and it's been an absolute honor doing this job along with my fellow Dante Topo. And thank you to everyone who has come to the ATH this year. It's been a great time. This is my last time saying this famous sentence up here. Good evening and welcome to the Marion Minor Cook Athenaeum. As I said, my name is Shannon Miller and I'm one of the 2 ATH Fellows this year. At CMC and in much of the Robert Day School's programming on campus, we pride ourselves on embracing interdisciplinary learning, finding and exploring the intersections of different subjects in ways that help us better apply our studies to solving real-world problems. We seek to produce students who are not only thinkers and scholars, but doers and leaders. I believe our speaker tonight, Professor J. Bradford DeLong, is an excellent addition to that tradition. DeLong is a professor of economics at UC Berkeley, where he also chairs the political economy major, and a quick survey of his career demonstrates his ability to connect conversations through multiple subjects to create comprehensive narratives about historical forces and social and political change, rather than taking a narrow focus on economics as an isolated discipline. For example, while Professor DeLong is an economist, his research interests also extend to technological and industrial revolutions, finance and corporate control, the rise and fall of social democracy, the history of economic thought, the rise of the West, and the causes of the Great Depression. Along those lines, his talk tonight will discuss the Great Depression and the Great Recession in the North Atlantic. DeLong has been a full professor at UC Berkeley since 1997, prior to which he served in the Clinton administration's Treasury Department, where he worked on the 1993 federal budget, Clinton's healthcare reform efforts, and numerous trade issues. Outside of his teaching, he runs a blog on political and economic issues and co-edits The Economist's Voice with Joseph Stiglitz and Aaron Edlin. As the keynote speaker for the Robert Day School's Awards Night, Professor DeLong will deliver the 2015 McKenna Lecture on International Trade and Economics. For the last time, I must remind you that audio and visual recording are strictly prohibited. Thank you for a fantastic year at the ATH, and please join me in welcoming Professor Brad DeLong.
Back in 1959, Arthur Burns, then chair of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Eisenhower, lifelong Republican senior policymaker, one of the very few good friends Richard M. Nixon had, and chair of the Federal Reserve from 1970 to 1978. Back in 1959, Arthur Burns gave the presidential address to the American Economic Association. In it, his conclusion was that the United States had a lot of choices to make as far as its future economic institutions and economic policies were concerned. And he said, quote, "These choices have to be made by the people, and economists will do more than any other group in the end to help make them." That's you, economists or future economists, that is. And that is why I am glad to be here. That is, that you are joining us, and I am very glad that you are joining us, for all of us in America and the world really need you, really need us. I think Arthur Burns was right. I think we are better positioned than any other group to help us make the right choices at the world and at the national level, at the level of individual states within the United States, at the level of the city, the business, the school district, the NGO seeking to figure out how to focus its limited resources, whatever. So why did Arthur Burns say this, and why do I think he was right? 2 blocks away, after all, you have the people over at Harvey Mudd, people who will say that they understand technologies and that we don't. That we are, in fact, like Jon Snow of Game of Thrones. who I strongly believe is really John Targaryen Stark, the son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark, and will wind up riding the second of the dragons in the final episode if they ever get there. But that pass. No. But that from the perspective of Harvey Mudd, we are like Jon Snow and know nothing. Now, I would say that while the engineering principles they learn over there at Harvey Mudd will endure forever, the knowledge of actual technologies they gain, those will be largely obsolete in 1 decade and completely obsolete in 2. I learned to program in Fortran back in the really old days, and when my research assistants watch me write code, they either laugh, they cry, they say, "Don't do that again." They say, "Translating your Fortran into a modern programming language is really not helpful at all. Please stop." Economists, by contrast, know about systems and about how systems work. We have built up over the past 300 years a great deal of rules of thumb and theoretical principles and insights and guesses and a history of places to look to understand how a bunch of people, when we get them together in a complicated societal system, usually mediated by the market, under conditions of scarcity and exchange, is going to work. And if you get how the system works right, there will be many opportunities to figure out how to use and apply the technologies, not least because the people over at Harvey Mudd who understand the technologies will learn that they can and do need to make money by teaching us about them. Get how the system works wrong, and your technological knowledge is going to point you in the wrong direction. So your heads should swell. Right? I think you've all made a good choice in coming to CMC and in coming to Robert Day. But I don't want your heads to swell too much. So let me tell you a story about today and about how economists as a group, definitely including me, got a very big question very wrong. So let us return to Arthur Burns and his presidential address back in 1959. In it, his first and his major point was that a business cycle episode like the one experienced in the 1930s, like the Great Depression, and like the one we have just been through and are hopefully now emerging from, that was a very remote possibility, if it was a possibility at all. And let me quote Arthur Burns at extended length, quote, back in 1959. "More than 25 years have elapsed since we last experienced a financial crisis or a deep depression. Over 20 years have passed since we last had a severe business recession. There is no parallel for such a sequence of mild cycles, at least during the past 100 years. The character of the business cycle appears to have changed. The evolution of corporate practice and the growth of corporate enterprise has served to reduce the influence of a cyclical decline on the flow of income. The expansion and the means of financing of government enterprise have had a similar effect. Specific measures adopted by government in dealing with the recessions of the post-war period have varied, but in all of them, monetary, fiscal, and housekeeping policies have played some part, and the net result has been the intensity of cyclical swings has become much smaller. It seems reasonable to expect the structural changes which have served to moderate and humanize the business cycle will continue to do so. Of late, many economists have been speaking persuasively, though not always as grimly, of a future of secular inflation. That warning is timely." And that's the end of the quote. And between 1959 and 2007, for nearly half a century, the overwhelming majority of American economists, at least, would have endorsed Arthur Burns's conclusions. In fact, things got even better from the perspective of unemployment. After 2 moderate recessions in the middle and just after the end of the 1970s, the size of the business cycle in employment and production shrunk again well below what Arthur Burns had seen looking back in time from 1959 giving rise to what was called the Great Moderation. Arthur Burns's warning that the big economic threat had become inflation was nearly a decade too soon to be properly timely in the sense that you could have made a lot of money by trading on it, but it too was correct. However, after the 1970s, that threat too went away. Yet as of 2007, the overwhelming bulk of American economists were still keeping their weather eye on inflationary problems of too much money chasing too few goods, provoked either by exchange rate depreciation, legislatures that could not muster the nerve to do their proper public finance job, or simply central banks falling victim to growth optimism in a boom. Thus, what happened after 2007 in the entire North Atlantic came to nearly all economists as an astonishing surprise. Economists like Nouriel Roubini, like my sometime co-author Paul Krugman, like me, we would have said we had told you so if a drying up of the flow of finance from China had provoked a major worldwide crisis. If a drying up of the flow of finance had led to a crash of investment spending in the United States, a steep fall in the value of the dollar, the bankruptcy of under-regulated large New York banks, and an outbreak of inflation that caused a painful stagflation episode, Nouriel, Paul, and I would have said, yeah, we warned about that, we saw that coming. That's not what we got. Economists like my teacher Marty Feldstein and Michael Boskin would have said, we told you so. If failures to either raise taxes or cut entitlements had given the Federal Reserve an unpleasant choice between validating a market increase in interest rates to prevent inflation and accepting higher unemployment, or trying to keep interest rates to preserve employment at the price of higher inflation, and only a very, very few, like my other sometime co-author Dean Baker, saw the housing sector as large enough and disturbed enough to be a source of serious danger. That after all, as of the end of the housing boom, as of the end of 2007, estimates were that we had only built 1 million excess houses in the desert between Los Angeles and Albuquerque, and that we only had $500 billion at risk in subprime loans that quite probably would not be paid off, and a world economy with $80 trillion of financial assets ought to be able to swallow, allocate, and move on after a $500 billion speculative loss with no problem at all. Yet what has happened since 2007 has been an order of magnitude worse than even Dean envisioned in his worst mid-2000s nightmares. For even today, 8% of the economic wealth that back in 2007 we confidently expected to have now, it has simply vanished. Workers all across the North Atlantic have fewer jobs. Workers all across the North Atlantic are less productive. Our businesses still have idle capacity relative to the capacity they'd built up in 2008. There's been very, very little net private investment since then, and yet you don't find many places that are running on 2 or more shifts at all, that are economizing ferociously on their capital. Productive links in the global division of labor that ought to have been built up in the past decade have not been. Productive links in the global division of labor that existed back in 2007 have been broken and not repaired. And this year I can say that those of you who are graduating who are male still face the worst job market for newly minted male college graduates in American history, albeit slightly better than 2012-2014 and somewhat better than 2009 to 2011, but worse than in any other year or years. And for those of you who are female, the job market is better in the past only because of the sharp reduction in discrimination. Remember that when Sandra Day O'Connor graduated from Stanford Law School as number 3 in the class, she could not get a single offer from a private sector law firm for a job at any level. The totally properly discounted losses from the Great Depression of the 1930s they cumulated to something like 1.4 times the initial year's GDP in the United States, and to half that in Western Europe. Perhaps that economic loss total is a massive understatement of the true cost of the Great Depression. One can believe that in the absence of the Great Depression, Europe's downfall into Nazism and World War II would have been avoided, and 40 million people would have avoided premature deaths. But then, since every 50 years between 115 BC and 1945, an army crosses the Rhine going one way or another to kill, burn, destroy, and try to change the language spoken by the mayor of Strasbourg, it would be rash to assume that Europe since 1930 would have entered into the long peace we've seen since 1945, even had the Great Depression been avoided. Restrict ourselves to the narrow measure of the costs, however. Assume that in the absence of the financial crisis of 2007-8 and what followed, production in the entire North Atlantic would have followed its pre-2007 trend. Then sometime next year, the total losses from the current unpleasantness in Europe in accumulation will pass the Great Depression as a share of GDP. And if we stay on our current trajectory in the United States, rather than finding some way to restore pre-2007 trends of growth, come 2026, the Great Depression will no longer be America's greatest depression. And if we are still well below the counterfactual trend then, the costs of 2007, 2009 will only mount thereafter. Diagnoses of how we got into this mess, why we are still mired in it or semi-mired in it, especially since it was not something that was on the radar as a 1 sigma or a 2 sigma or a 3 sigma or even a 4 sigma probability back in 2007 vary. But let me give you my take, and it's disputable, and indeed often disputed. My take is very similar to that of my next-door office neighbor at Berkeley, Barry Eichengreen. You should read Barry's version of the argument in his excellent and brand new book, Hall of Mirrors. But let me give you my slightly variant take and say that one of the many important factors that led to our current mess was the intellectual success of a single book. That is Milton Friedman and Anna Jacobson Schwartz's 1963 Monetary History of the United States shaped the world that American economists saw in 2007 and shaped it in a counterproductive way. Let's move on from 1959 to the late 60s, the 1970s, and in the 1980s, when monetarist economists drawing their analysis from Friedman and Schwartz's Monetary History advanced their particular economic historical interpretation of the causes and course of the 1930s Great Depression. They saw it as due to an improper and non-neutral to a contractionary monetary policy. They were opposed by other economists. Some others, we call them Keynesians, focused on fluctuations in the irrational animal spirits of businesses and thus of business willingness to engage in investment spending, on the limited power of central banks and monetary policy to counter the coordinated shifts in business class psychology that we see, and thus saw the Great Depression as originating primarily in an unstable private sector and in the inability or unwillingness of the government to directly command and control the flow of spending through the economy. Still others, called them Minskyites, but they were always a small sect, saw the private sector instability as overwhelmingly driven by financial sector instability, driven by a failure to properly regulate, control, and limit credit. As my Minskyite friend Bill Janeway of Warburg Pincus says, give the banking system too much unregulated credit, and you know what they will eventually do. You just do not know against which wall they will do it. And 1929 to 1933 was the biggest such episode before 2007, 2009, which was somewhat bigger. But the Great Depression, Friedman and his co-author Anna Jacobson Schwartz had argued, was at its root a failure of government. The private economy was stable. The Great Depression was due solely and completely to the failure of the 1929 to 33 Federal Reserve to properly and aggressively expand the monetary base in order to keep the economy's money stock stable as a neutral monetary policy required. And no decline in the money stock, no Great Depression, the failure to follow a neutral monetary policy, and then Friedman translates that into an active disturbance by government incompetence. That was the reason the 1930s downturn became the Great Depression. Now, this interpretation made coherent sense if you bought a particular premise, that the velocity of money, the speed which people spent the cash in their pockets and the demand deposits in their banking accounts, would vary little with changes in interest rates. And this interpretation involved some fast talk and fast dancing as to what exactly a neutral monetary policy was. What Friedman and Schwartz called a neutral monetary policy in the Great Depression would have required the Federal Reserve flood the zone with liquidity, buy bonds and print cash at a rate never before imagined, and that in fact the Federal Reserve in the Great Depression was unable to imagine. But would such a neutral monetary policy be enough? Suppose the velocity of money was interest elastic, then open market operations undertaken to expand the monetary base would have pushed down interest rates and caused a further fall in monetary velocity, and perhaps made Friedman and Schwartz's cure powerless. And if Keynesian psychological shifts in the animal spirits of the business class or fears provoked by Minskyite financial crisis and a resulting flight to safety were to push interest rates down far enough, and if the elasticity of money demand was high enough, the Great Depression would have come even with a neutral monetary policy, according to Friedman and Schwartz's lights. Friedman and Schwartz rejected that possibility. They said that was outside of historical experience. And the monetarists won the economic, historical, and the macroeconomic debate in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s in the United States. People gnawed away at different pieces of the framework, but that didn't matter. Why didn't it matter? Well, I think it did not matter because the debate was really two debates. And for the first, the technocratic historical debate, the evidence was not decisive on either side. The counterfactual was too far away from actual historical experience for the existing variation in the data to be fully convincing. And yet Friedman and Schwartz won a nearly total victory. That is, the debate between monetarists, Keynesians, and Minskyites turned out to be more than a simple empirical matter of reading the evidence on was the interest elasticity of money demand in a serious downturn low, as Milton Friedman claimed, or high, as in John Hicks's and John Maynard Keynes's liquidity trap. Were financial markets a near veil, with the money stock being a near sufficient statistic for predicting total spending, as Milton Friedman claimed? Or was the credit channel and its functioning of decisive importance, as Hyman Minsky warned? This debate would not have produced a decisive victory for one way or the other. But at the second level, the debate was whether market failure or government failure was the bigger threat. The Great Depression had, before Friedman and Schwartz's monetary history, been seen as an unanswerable argument that market failure was potentially so dire as to require the government to potentially take over direction of the whole economy, at least as far as its macroeconomic aggregates were concerned. And that created a presumption that there might well be other smaller market failures that might require the government to be interventionist indeed, not just in macro, but in micro as well. But if the Great Depression could be understood as a failure of government, then the cognitive dissonance between the reality of the Depression and right-of-center economists' presumption that government failure was likely to be a bigger threat than market failure in any concrete case, that cognitive dissonance could be erased. And that, I think, provided a decisive underlying tide as Friedman and Schwartz's macroeconomic doctrine advanced from victory to victory in the 1970s and 1980s. And of course, then came 2008 to 2010. The head of the Federal Reserve was Ben Bernanke. Ben Bernanke had said to Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz at a conference back in 2002, "We understand the Great Depression. You are right, we did it. We're very sorry, but thanks to you, we will not do it again." So when a situation that looked very much like 1929 to 1933 came around again, Ben Bernanke was ready, and Ben Bernanke was ready with a Friedmanite cure. And so the Friedmanite cure was tried à outrance over 2008 and 2010. The monetary policy that Ben Bernanke pursued cushioned the downturn, and the U.S. has done better than Western Europe, about to the extent that Bernanke was more aggressive in lowering interest rates and buying bonds for cash than his European counterparts like Trichet, who was less Friedmanite and more Hayekian and ordo-liberal in his orientation. But the textbook Friedmanite cure proved insufficient. That means that we revisit the Great Depression as well. For if the Friedmanite cure proved insufficient in 2008, 2010, Friedman's confident assertions it would have been sufficient in 1929 to 1933 lose a great deal of their credibility. But right now, Ben Bernanke, now at the Brookings Institution, has taken a look back at the situation and has changed his mind. He is now a Keynesian, calling for expansionary fiscal policy, especially infrastructure, as the best road forward for America and for Europe in the current situation, saying that the Friedmanite policies he pursued and perhaps over-pursued were helpful, but that fiscal and credit are needed as well, that Keynes and Minsky have very important things to say. In fact, Paul Krugman now says, it seems to have simply taken Ben Bernanke a month at the Brookings Institution to start sounding like him. So, from today's perspective, the completeness of the monetarist victory back in the 1970s and 1980s is a puzzle that needs explaining. Evidence did not weigh strongly enough to account for a decisive victory, and the completeness of the victory must, I think, be attributed to the fact that economics is never simply technocratic, but always political economy, and hence always politics. And that means, as British economist John Stuart Mill lamented back in the 1840s, that there is no analytic position so absurd that it has not been advanced by some political economist of note and reputation. That was true then. That is true today. And back in the 1970s and 1980s, I think, to admit that the monetarist cure was inadequate for the Great Depression, to admit that the Great Depression had deeper roots than simply the failure of central banks charged with maintaining a neutral monetary policy to do so, that could not be fully consistent with a strong and optimistic belief that social democracy had been oversold, and that the experience of the 1960s and 1970s had taught us that government failure was almost invariably a worse danger than market failure. The result was a very strong elective affinity, especially in a neoliberal age, between a mainstream economics profession swimming in those currents and the Friedmanite interpretation of the Great Depression. And because the intellectual victory in the 1970s and 1980s was so complete, policymakers in 2008, 2010 were hesitant and unwilling to apply the Keynesian and Minskyite cures to severe downturns enthusiastically enough and on a large enough and sustained enough scale to adequately deal with the problems that emerged. When the collapse came, the economists advising the policymakers of the North Atlantic were not ready. That's the end of my story. The little lesson from the story? Well, the first little lesson is we really should not be satisfied with the current state of the economy. That we should be pressing for policies to not just stabilize the situation, but to reverse the damage. Right? That somewhere in the counterfactual multiverse out there, an American and a Western European economy 8% more prosperous than what we have today is out there just beyond our reach, just on some other quantum mechanical branch of the multiverse. But unfortunately, we have decohered from it and can't get back to it from some Schrödinger-esque process, but will require hard work to change our institutions and change our policies to get there. But that's just the little lesson. The big lesson is that your ideology, like fire and like we hope someday the people at Harvey Mudd will bring us nuclear fusion power, that fire and fusion turn out to be good servants but terrible masters, that ideologies make sense of the entire world and we badly need them. Our brains cannot handle too much complexity. We have evolved them barely far enough to make it this far. We are trying to manage an immensely complex global technological division of labor encompassing 7.3 billion West African plains apes with brains that are barely well enough designed to figure out whether it's safe to leap to the next branch, whether the fruit is properly ripe, and which water holes the leopard hangs out at. We thus need a lot of conceptual help. But our ideologies break in our hands precisely because they force the world to make sense and make a single kind of sense. And the world may well be a surprising place and may not make single coherent sense or may not make that particular kind of sense. Thus, we can accept the conclusion that decentralized market economies, our societal institutions, are among our great blessings. John Maynard Keynes liked to call this individualism. And as he wrote in his General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, quote, "The traditional advantages of individualism still hold good. Let us remind ourselves of what these advantages are. The efficiency of decentralization of decisions and of individual responsibility are perhaps even greater than the 19th century supposed. Individualism is the best safeguard of personal liberty in the sense that it greatly widens the field for the exercise of personal choice and is the base safeguard of the variety of life which emerges precisely from the extended field of personal choice, and the loss of which is the greatest of all the losses of the homogeneous or totalitarian state. For this variety preserves traditions which embody the most successful choices of former generations and colors the present with the diversification of its fancy, and being the handmaid of experiment is the most powerful instrument to better the future," unquote. Milton Friedman started from that observation about the benefits of individualism and built a bridge to the conclusion that therefore episodes like the Great Depression were impossible if only the central bank maintained a constant money stock and thus a neutral monetary policy, and that neutral monetary policy would all by itself be sufficient to guard against big depressions. That bridge was a bridge too far, yet the rest of we economists crossed over it, and so we were in no shape to properly advise the world when 2008 came, for which we should be sorry. And let me stop there and call for questions.
If you have a question, please raise your hand and Henrietta or myself will come to you with a microphone. And as always, priority for questions go to students.
Thank you so much for coming and for your probably the most entertaining econ talk that I've listened to as a non-econ major.
I see. Okay. Are you saying the bar is low?
It was more interdisciplinary than many of the other econ talks I've heard. My question is related to sort of then what the solution is moving forward. What branch of the three solutions, I guess, that diverged in the 60s or in the 70s and 80s that you described would be the ideal one to follow, or sort of what combination of them would get us to that other multidimensional option that you described, or that alternative dimension that you described?
Well, if the problem with the monetarist solution is that it is inadequate in a world in which interest rates hit zero, and in which it turns out that there isn't a raw natural propensity to spend the cash in your pocket. That is, there were people back in the 1970s and 1980s who argued strenuously with some evidence that even at an interest rate of zero, if you have cash in your pocket or cash in your checking account, you're not going to be able to avoid spending it, that people spend what is liquid. If they can't help themselves. That has turned out not to be true. Right? When the interest rate drops to zero, the marginal propensity to spend out of your cash drops to zero as well. So that means that monetarism is inadequate. If the situation is ever going to be bad enough that short-term safe interest rates hit zero. Hyman Minsky himself said Minskyism is inadequate because the same psychological currents, institutions, and practices that lead to excessive leverage and excessive risk-taking that then leads to the clogging and destruction of the credit channel, that regulators and politicians swim in the same sea. Right, that back in 2002, 2003, the late Ned Gramlich, governor of the Federal Reserve, went to Fed Chair Alan Greenspan and said, you got to do something about subprime mortgages. Right, these things aren't going to be paid back. These are stupid and ridiculous loans to make. We need to step in with the regulatory process and stop them. And the way that he reported it, Greenspan gave a three-part answer. The first part was that if you buy a house beyond Riverside on a 3-year teaser mortgage of 2% per year that then escalates up to 10%, what you're really buying is a low rent for 3 years and an option to then buy the house when the mortgage reverts to its normal subprime level. When it turns out that you can't afford the house when the teaser rate ends, you feel sad because you've lost a good thing you could see, but you're not really injured. You have instead gotten a relatively cheap rent in a big 5-bedroom house in Riverside with a nice swimming pool for 3 years. You're not really an injured party. Thus, the borrowers aren't really injured. And the lenders are injured, but they're relatively rich and being stupid. And there is social value involved in taking money away from stupid rich people. They aren't going to use it. Greenspan still is a serious disciple of Ayn Rand, and that's the Randite coming out. And third, Greenspan said the lenders want to lend, the borrowers want to borrow. Both have phones and can call their members of Congress. How long will we survive as a central bank if we say we are in the business of stopping you from making deals you want to make? Thus, Minsky said that the only guarantee against having the kind of financial boom, excess, credit, collapse, depression cycle that we've just had, the only guarantee against it is having had another one within the past 30 years so that the senior people on Wall Street remember it. And that once those 30 years pass, you're vulnerable, and that there's nothing that our political system can do to adequately regulate. So that's depressing. And of course, the Keynesian road requires that you have excessive trust in the government's ability to successfully manage the flow of spending through the economy and to serve as a major source of both risk-bearing capacity and as a major judge of which investments are worth undertaking. And government failure is certainly less than having a big depression, but government failures are not things to be sneezed at and ignored either. So we're driven to an Aristotelian position that since none of the pure types seem to be adequate, we got to try to cobble together something that's in the medium. And the details of the institutions matter. But I don't think anyone has come up with a convincing or even a half convincing framework of how you manage to strike the golden Aristotelian mean between the three possible positions to properly guide our institutions going forward. One of my other old teachers, IMF chief economist Olivier Blanchard, ran a conference on precisely this last month. It was supposed to be entitled Rethinking Macroeconomics Progress. The title, actually, because Larry Summers objected to saying we'd made progress, was Rethinking Macroeconomics Progress or Confusion, ? And afterwards, my feeling was the right title was Rethinking Macroeconomics, Confusion.
So as a actual former student of Minsky, I always felt the title of his book, having sat through a class, Stabilizing the Unstable Economy, was a bit of a misnomer. He never got to the stabilizing part.
Indeed not.
So as you kind of answered this question, but I wanted to ask, do you see any policy recommendations in the Minsky program? Because I have to confess, after a semester, I didn't.
I see. Okay. Well, that's bad news. Right. Charlie Kindleberger had many ideas along these lines, which, if you could sum them up, were that you actually needed to have a powerful lender of last resort in order to successfully manage the crisis when it came, right, and immediately enforce both the lending, right, and in order to keep the system from crashing, and the putting of insolvent institutions to receivership and then working out their bad debts. But that it was also very important that no one really be certain that the lender of last resort would be there in a crisis. And everyone had to properly fear that it would not be. And as Kindleberger said, for the lender of last resort to always be there when the crisis comes, but for its appearance to always be doubted beforehand, is a really neat trick and very difficult to pull off. But Kindleberger's view was that we had no option but to try. And this requires having powerful central banks and super central banks on a global scale willing to intervene technocratically, but also ones that are relatively free from regulatory capture from the banks that they regulate. Right? That is Walter Bagehot, who is perhaps first in this line of kind of Minsky-Kindleberger theorists, set out in the 1870s the rule of what to do in a financial crisis, which is that you should lend freely to anyone who is short of cash as long as they have assets that would be good collateral in normal times, I mean, if the crisis weren't doing there, and you should lend at a penalty rate. We didn't do that last part in 2008, 2009, right? And if you went to Tim Geithner and Ben Bernanke and so forth then and say, why aren't you lending at a penalty rate? They would say, well, if we charge these banks large, high interest rates, then everyone knows they're completely bankrupt. And the whole thing collapses. We have to pretend that they're solvent but just illiquid to get through the system. To which the answer, I thought, and others of us kind of wild-eyed thought, was that if lending at a penalty rate puts an institution into bankruptcy, then it ought to be in receivership already. Its equity holders and its option holders ought to be zeroed out from the beginning. But that wasn't a step that Hank Paulson, Tim Geithner's predecessor as Treasury Secretary, was willing to take. After all, Goldman Sachs had been very good to him, and thus it had to be a valuable social asset to the country, and the idea of liquidating it or even putting it into receivership, zeroing out its equity holders and its options, and then sometime in the future reprivatizing it, was a step too far from him. And Tim Geithner's thought since 2008, I have a hard time following. It is, he really doesn't seem to believe much in expansionary fiscal policy or in expansionary monetary policy, but he does believe in financial confidence, which seems very much that the reality of the world is that we live in a world of finance capitalism in which the big money center banks have us collectively by the plums, and all we can do is feed them as much money as they demand and hope that they're then willing to fund investment one way or another. If I had to put Geithner think into one sentence, it would be that. And that's not a kind of thinking that will guard against the next crisis or against a repetition of this cycle. We'll try to do better next time, you know. So.
Thank you so much for coming to speak here. First of all,
Yes.
I'd like to say that I very much do hope that you're correct and that Jon Snow ends up riding a dragon. If not, all my time spent watching Game of Thrones will be most sorely wasted.
Okay.
Now, secondly, I wanted to ask a question about sort of regarding the Europe versus the U.S. and their responses to the 07 and 09 crisis. And sort of what was different that sort of took Europeans so long to sort of get it and sort of copy the Americans, which are now doing to some extent? And then secondly, coming off that first question, what could you perhaps comment on the QE program that the ECB has now started, and what potential you see it having in the future? Thank you.
And I remember in May of 2010, my colleague Christina Romer down the hall, who then was serving as chief economist of the Council of Economic Advisors, came back on a trip through Berkeley. And this was just after the Greek crisis. And her view was that the Greek crisis was, if anything, an opportunity, simply because the Greek economy was so small and their debt was so small relative to the total debt capacity of Europe. And the Greek government had behaved very badly. They'd borrowed a lot of money with no plans for ever raising the taxes to ever repay it. But the German banks and the European investment banks had also behaved badly. They'd loaned the money and had carefully jiggered the accounts to make these look like good loans, even though had they been doing their due diligence, it would have been obvious that there was no serious way, short of an industrial revolution in Greece in the next decade, that this debt would be repaid. But the amount of money was so small, and so the European Union could get its act together and say, gee, why did we admit Greece to the European Union in the first place? Oh, we did so because it was the original homeland of democracy. And we felt attached to them and that they deserved their chance because, Athens, the Parthenon, Athena, Nike, Sophocles, so forth, and bailing out the Greek debt, that is refinancing it all in Deutschmarks or euros, and then over the course of the next 2 generations letting inflation gradually eat it away, that this is simply one of the prices we pay for being Europe. That would be easy to do, that would be cheap, and that would make everyone recognize that the European Central Bank and the European Union stood behind the debts of Southern Europe and avoid further bank runs on Portugal, Spain, Italy, France, things that the ECB would be unable to handle. That after all, in 1991, during the savings and loan crisis, the United States Congress transferred 25% of Texas's GDP to it in a year in the form of a savings and loan bailout. And yet no one except for the then senior senator from New York, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, took great exception to this and complained massively. To him, we then pointed out that, we transferred 25% of the year's GDP to Texas, but they then immediately turned around and paid 10% of that back to New York financiers immediately, so would you please be quiet? There are very large transfers to bad actors going on here, but they're necessary to system stability, And we want people believing that they are one civilization, one people, one nation, one fiscal system, one banking system, one monetary system. That spreading the risk is one of the things that governments are for. And that's not what we have in Europe, right? We barely have one civilization. We certainly don't have one people. We don't have one banking regulatory system. We don't have fiscal transfers. All we have is a currency union. And we have a currency union that's supposed to have an inflation target of a little bit less than 2% per year. But in a situation like now, a Europe-wide target of 2% per year means that inflation should be 0 in Southern Europe and 4% per year in Germany and Holland. And yet the ECB has not been following that policy of 4% per year in Germany and Holland. It's been following that policy of 1% per year. So Europe has an entirely new, bigger set of problems than the United States, and as I can see, is unlikely to figure out a way out of them over the course of the next decade. And so every time I see my teacher, Marty Feldstein, who warned us about this in the mid-1990s, I say, Marty, you told me so. And he says, well, that's great to hear now, but what do we do? And we come up empty. That is, quantitative easing looks like a reasonable step to take for Europe now, but it's going to have small effects. Say, suppose you buy an extra 2 trillion euros of long duration bonds. At current interest rates, the kind of pure term risk premium associated with those bonds is perhaps 50 basis points, right? And 2 trillion euros times 50 basis points, that's 10 billion euros a year. So what quantitative easing is doing, if it doesn't raise expectations of inflation, is that it's taking off of the books of the private sector market risk that banks required to be paid 10 billion euros a year to bear last year in Europe. And that 10 billion euros a year of compensated risk-bearing capacity, that risk-bearing capacity is now available to use to fund other more fundamental investments that'll put people to work. And in the context of the European economy as a whole, adding a factor of production that contributes 10 billion euros a year to income is very small potatoes. And there's no sign that quantitative easing will turn into what Bernanke back in 1999, when he suggested applying to Japan, thought it would, into a commitment to a higher inflation rate over the long term. So a positive step, but a very minor step.
For a great talk. My question has to do with something you hinted, which is the rise of monetarist philosophy happened despite the fact that it did not have the ability to explain the world. Mm-hmm. So there were clearly some political, economic or reasons, and I wanted you to speculate a little bit what led to the political domination of the monetarist philosophy when it was not very good in explaining everything about the world. Was it a path-dependent process that in the 70s and the 80s, government failures had become more visible, especially in the developing world? Was it the rise of, or the elections of Margaret Thatcher and Reagan? What were the factors, or was it networks that the monetarist economist had greater power with the political establishment? Could you say a little bit about what led to the political dominance of a view that had some weaknesses?
Well, it has grave weaknesses. There are economists who will still say that the real problem was in fact the great moderation choice of a 2% per year inflation target. Yeah, that is, that if we'd been satisfied with the inflation rate in the North Atlantic in the late 1980s of 4 to 5% a year or so, then the fact that it was still visibly costly to people who would otherwise be investing in real assets to hold the liabilities of the central bank in their portfolio would have meant that central banks could indeed do the job of successfully stabilizing monetary policy, even if not through a monetarist rule. That not Friedman's monetarism Mark I, but rather some more flexible monetarism like Mark II might have been adequate. And you can find thoughts or hints of such thoughts in the writings of, again, my teacher Olivier Blanchard at the IMF. His demands for a 4% per year inflation target, which he has gotten the rest of the IMF to sign on to, which puts the IMF at the very leftmost fringe of the policy spectrum, right? Which means that the IMF, which was designed that back in 1944, the World Bank was designed to be the grant and the aid organization, the development bank. The IMF was designed to be the loan organization, the enforcer of monetary and fiscal orthodoxy. And the hope that was by separating those two, you could properly construct social democracy, because the IMF would require policy rationality and sustainability, while the World Bank would properly fund development and growth. In the end, it turned out that the World Bank was never funded at the proper level to actually do its job, and besides didn't have the technocratic competence to actually man or support investment in developing countries, that it did a good job for post-World War II European reconstruction, but little else, and et cetera. That only one of the Bretton Woods organizations worked well, and that was the IMF bringing down the hammer on governments that had not sustainable policies. And for those of us who grew up in that world, for the IMF to suddenly submerge and then reappear at the far left of the policy spectrum as kind of the leader of the Sixth International, such as to the extent we have one, as the standard bearer for social democracy in the 21st century. The only thing weirder than that is that Jan Hatzius, chief economist for Goldman Sachs, has joined them, and has also been for more expansionary monetary, fiscal, and credit policies without interruption since 2008, in a very striking divergence from the traditional Wall Street and the traditional Goldman Sachs view. Of course, maybe this is because Goldman Sachs is smart enough to realize that a lot of the debt assets it holds are now really equity as long as the economy stays depressed, and that its portfolio does not benefit from tight, but rather from loose money. That it's very strange times. I tend to think that ideas are very important, that Keynes was right when he said that madmen in authority hearing voices in the air are often hearing the voice of some defunct academic scribbler, and that if only Milton Friedman had been less good as a debater, or more willing to give ground and say that in extreme circumstances, monetarist policies may well prove unsuccessful. Indeed, Milton Friedman changed his mind when in the 1990s, maintaining a stable money stock was consistent with Japan's lost decade. Friedman moved from being a stabilize the quantity theory of money theorist to a massive quantitative easing theorist, saying that the Bank of Japan should buy bonds for cash and should keep buying bonds for cash until projections of future nominal GDP spending were where the Bank of Japan wanted them to be. And how would you know when you'd bought enough bonds for cash? Because when the economy had recovered and when nominal spending was back on its path, right? He was willing to change his mind. But he was also very persuasive, and by 2007 he was dead. The problem with my holding to this primacy of economic literacy, knowledge, and theory as a force directing the forces of the fates of nations view is that it's a professional and situational deformation. I would have it, wouldn't I? I'm an economist who wants to believe that what I say and recommend matters, aren't I? Therefore, I'm the last person you should ask for an objective understanding of how it is that economic ideas and events interact to produce doctrines and policies. For that, if you want to go to Berkeley, you should go to the sociology department and to Marion Fourcade-Gorenshaw, who studies economists and economic doctrines. You shouldn't ask me.
I have an additional question. Seems like one of the main takeaways from this question and answer period is in response to questions of, well, what do we do next? What are the theories on what to do about Europe? What are the theories on what to do about QE in the United States? It seems to be working kind of slowly. How do we move forward? There's sort of a collective shrug. We're absent an ideology, or at least a pure type that you described, that can reasonably make sense of all the complicated stuff that's causing us a lot of problems.
Yeah.
So then that reminds me of the post-Great Depression experience, where it took then 30 years until the 1970s and 80s for Milton Friedman to come up with something that was convincing to enough people that it could be followed.
Right.
I'm worried then, what do we do in the meantime as we wait for that theory to arise? The Great Depression had I use this term very loosely, the benefit of a war which could allow for massive domestic spending to massively increase demand, and the fact that a lot of the people who might otherwise be clamoring for jobs were getting killed by the Nazis. Things like that are probably not, hopefully, in our near future. So then what are the less murderous alternatives?
Well, after all, in 1985, Ronald Reagan did say to Mikhail Gorbachev that if only we had detected aliens outside the solar system and worried that they might possibly be hostile, we would immediately settle all our disagreements completely and 100% and band together, wouldn't we? And it's unclear how Gorbachev reacted to this. Really unclear. It was not something he expected. It was definitely not in the talking points he'd been given by Secretary of State George Shultz. The decisive element in the victory of Keynesian economics in Britain and the United States did indeed come with the fact that the unemployment problems of Britain and the United States, which many had thought were structural and unsolvable, melted away instantaneously when governments stopped worrying about the consequences of running up their debt. And that the Keynesian analytical apparatus proved as extremely useful in trying to figure out how to manage inflation during the war, as it, in retrospect, looked as it would have been useful during the Great Depression. However, we have no moral equivalent of global war because we have no Hitler in the process of killing 50 million people, 6 million of them Jews, while he decides that the future for Germany requires doing to the Slavs of Eastern Europe what Americans did to the Indians in the 19th century, except at 100 times the scale, right? And with 1,000 times the casualties, right? That the plan was to herd the entire Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe onto reservations, those who survived and weren't worked to death, and make all of Eastern Europe into one gigantic Iowa populated by German mechanized farmers. It was serious genocide for which the extermination of the Jews was only the appetizer, right? The main course was coming. We do not have any threats of that magnitude or that require expenditures on that scale. However, a $500 billion a year in the United States, $500 billion a year in Europe, public infrastructure and technological research program funded by issuing additional government debt, especially at the current interest rates where people are actually paying the German government to hold their money. Right? That up until 9 years, if you buy a German government bond of up to 9 years duration, you get negative interest. It's simply that you don't want to keep the money, your cash, in a suitcase in your office for fear you'll fall victim to some version of the Italian job. That kind of limits people's willingness to hold cash in Europe, and thus their willingness to hold the safe assets that the United States government and the German government can now create. And that these interest rates, having the government direct an extra $1 trillion a year to blue sky research and to infrastructure across the North Atlantic does seem like a no-brainer. and indeed South Carolina Republican Ben Bernanke, completely acceptable and in fact the standard bearer of the Republican Party for Federal Reserve Chair back in 2005. Alan Greenspan's choice as successor agrees. And yet, politically, somehow it feels like a non-starter, both in Western Europe and in the United States. In Western Europe, we can understand, because a lot of it will involve the German government issuing bonds for expenditures being made in Southern Europe. And they are not one people in the way Americans are. But in the United States, it's much more puzzling why it's such a political non-starter.
I would also have one question. So we've addressed both the American economy here and the European one, but how about emerging markets globally, as well as, countries like China? Do you have, what are your thoughts on those? And how will that also affect the standing of the American economy globally?
That are my thoughts on emerging markets, right? On 5 billion people spread out in levels of prosperity from the highlands of Eritrea, where people live no better than our pre-industrial ancestors did 3,000 years ago, all the way up to economies that have just joined or are about to join the OECD, which started out originally as a club of Marshall Plan aid recipients, and has turned into an organization of countries whose problems are those of advanced industrial development countries rather than others. And I think the right answer is what the Jamaican Nobel Prize-winning economist W. Arthur Lewis said, which is that the developing world, what we now call emerging markets, is simply too big. And in it, we can always find 3 examples of everything. And to attempt to make generalizations about emerging markets is to doom you to failure, and to probably an ignominious analytical failure. Because what you'll say will be right about some country after the fact by luck, and grossly wrong about others. I will say that, indeed, as Charlie Kindleberger would say, that for the central bank of the United States, for the Federal Reserve, to think that it has that even though Congress tells it that its mission is to focus on full employment, price stability, moderate long-term interest rates in the United States, it is not in the long run security or economic interest for the United States for it to do so. That it really should take account of the fact that it is the provider of ultimate liquidity for the world as a whole, and that when New York catches cold, Buenos Aires and Bombay will catch pneumonia. And thus that the current plans of the Federal Reserve to start raising interest rates late this year will confront Raghu Rajan as governor of the Reserve Bank of India with some very difficult problems, because the last thing that Raghu Rajan needs right now is pressure on him to raise interest rates more, and yet that is what an increase in Federal Reserve rates will do. So I'd simply say the one thing that's certain about emerging markets is that they're put under additional and unnecessary stress when the North Atlantic gazes at its own navel and focuses on itself, and that's a bad thing.
We have time tonight for one last question.
Yes? In the back?
In the debate between Harvey Mudd and you economists,
Yes.
a Harvey Mudd student will remind you that your systems have a time response characteristics. You
Yes.
provided some kind of a portfolio of solutions,
Yes.
and to the most part, disappointed in the outcome without regard to some kind of an intrinsic time constant that it should be expected as the time that will take for the remedy to work. Can you address this issue of the time in the context of the solution?
As Milton Friedman said, economic policy acts with long and variable lags, which makes it particularly difficult. I think it was Charles Pardee who said that being on the Federal Reserve, it's like driving a car. It's like driving a car with the front window painted black as you head into the future by looking into the rearview mirror. And that's the problem with managing this particular system. And I think that Janet Yellen and Charles Evans and the other policymakers at the Federal Reserve will say they do the best they can, and that they run their optimal dynamic control models every week and rerun them every week, and then pause and try hard to think about what the models leave out. And whether Herb Simon's Science is the Artificial Declaration that you write down a simplified problem, find the optimal solution to that, and that will be a good solution to the more complicated real-world problem that's too complicated for you to write down, is in fact the right thing to do. It's a very difficult task. We're dealing with emergent properties of a system of 7.3 billion minds. And it's made especially difficult because these minds talk to each other, right? That we really are, in a sense, anthology intelligences. We tend to converge on the opinions that we find most persuasive for lots of reasons, which means that we find it almost impossible to properly do economic dynamics. Right, that Alfred Marshall, back in the late 19th century, laid out a framework, right, that there was a market day in which supplies were fixed, a short run in which employment and capital were fixed, a medium run in which investment and organizations could start to change, a long run in which you could make investments and liquidate businesses, and a very long run in which Malthusian or post-Malthusian demography held. But associating timescales with those was always very difficult, largely because the long run comes whenever people decide that it's time for them to come, whenever people coordinate their expectations on the belief that there's money to be made by assuming that prices are rapidly going to move to their long run values, in which case they do, and the long run comes. Which led to the observation of another one of my teachers, the late Rudy Dornbush, right? That the long run always takes much longer to come than any economist can say. That the economic systems stay out of equilibrium, out of reasonable long-run equilibrium for much longer than economists believe possible. And that in fact, the only sign that the long run is about to come is when economists start building models about why it will never come. But then when it does come, it comes much more rapidly than anyone can possibly imagine. So apologies for our ignorance, but it is genuine ignorance.
Well,
And
that's
thank
all
you
the time
very
we have
much.
tonight. Please join me in thanking Brad DeLong.